Let's take another look at functions and a concept about how variables work inside functions. And the concept is called variable scope. We'll talk about what that means. The question is, if you're thinking about a function as a black box where you can send some problem that you have and get an answer out of it, and the idea is you don't know how whoever coded that function may have coded it. Of course, if you're making the function, you do know how it's coded, but you have to pretend that it's all self-contained inside the black box. But is there anything going on in there that could affect the rest of our program? Is there any conflicts we need to worry about? Um, for instance, what if that person inside the black box used a variable name that you wanted to use? Is that a problem? Like if they use the variable Jiminy Cricket, how are you supposed to know if you can't see what is in the function? Or when you're creating the function, should you avoid using variables of the same name? Does it matter? That's the kinds of questions we want to answer. And so the thing to know when we talk about the scope of a variable, that functions are self-contained. Every variable in a function works only inside of that function where has been created. So variables are, yeah, they don't affect other parts of the code, and so therefore you don't have to worry when you go to create something. So that sounds simple, and it is kind of simple if you can remember it that way. But when you go to see it in action, it gets a little confusing. So let's take a look. If our main code is over here, and let's just say we set 5 into x, and then we make y equal x to the third power, and then we want to print it. So x 5 to the third power, that's 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 more is 125, right? So it's 125. So that's going to print out when we hit this print statement. Then we're going to go and we're going to call a function. We're going to say, hey, go do this do function. And then when you get back, we're going to print out y again and see if it's changed. So we go over here to the do function. It's not taking any parameters, but it is doing something. Look, it has its own variable that it called 5 or x, and it made it equal 5 again. And then this time the y is x squared, and it prints out the answer. So of course this is a silly example, but the variables are what we're concerned about here, not what the function is actually doing. And so here it prints out that y is 25. And then you go back over here, because once the function's done, then it comes back here and it prints y again. And now it's 125 again. So, I put the outputs on each side, but if you were to run this, you would get y equals 125, then would come over here and say y equals 25, and then over here again it would say y equals 125. So, how can y equal two different things? And the answer is the y in the main code and the y inside the function are, yeah, sure, they share a same name, but they have different values. It's just like, if you had the same name of somebody outside of your family. It's interesting that you share the same name, but it doesn't mean that you have any sort of relation with each other, right? So that's the term scope. The scope means, where can this variable be used? And by used, we mean referenced, like can you print it? Can you modify it? Can you say, oh, now we want the variable to equal something else? Do some math on it. So a local variable, which is what by default all variables are in Python and in functions, that means the variable only exists in the function where it's created, which we said before. And a global variable, which means you can set up special variables that can be seen by the entire code so that you can actually make changes to variables that the functions can see and kind of work on together. So there is such a thing as a global variable. And in this class, lots of times there are very nice local variables that we can use, but there are times where a global variable comes in really handy and makes things easier for us. So sometimes we purposefully set up that kind of variable, excuse me. Another concept that's related to this is called the variable lifespan. And what that means is, when you go to a function and you create a variable like named x, and when that function ends, then that x gets erased from memory. The computer doesn't need it anymore. If you call the function again, if you want to use the function over and over again, that's fine. Every time it runs the function, it creates a new variable, it saves that space in memory, and then it erases it from its memory as soon as it's done. So it can go into this cycle of creating it and erasing it, creating it and erasing it. A variable that's in the main code, where what we've been doing so far in class, that lives in memory from the time we say, hey, set this variable, and then when the program ends. So these end when the functions end. And if you think of your main code as a function, that it ends when the function ends as well. So this is why people get a little bit confused, and it has to do with parameters. So now we have, we set 5 equal to x, and we have y equals x cubed. But now we want to send that information to this function. And so we say, hey, send x and y over to this function. And this function says, hey, you're going to send me information that's called x and y. And the thing to know about this, like, it's still separate, is the main thing. These x's and y's, even though we sent them some values, these x's and y's are still different. It's again the same thing. There's like a line between your function and your code, and you can pass values, and those values get stuck into labels, but those labels can have the same name. And then the thing that I didn't write on here, but they don't have to have the same name. These values could have been called A and B. So over here it's saying, hey, take my X and send it, and take my Y and send it. And those are parameters. And if you wanted to, then you could come over here and you could say, okay, now in my function, we're going to call this A and we're going to call this B, and imagine that you've replaced all these. And it doesn't matter, right? Like, oh, but why don't you just call them the same thing that you did over here? Well, again, the point is a function can be a black box where we don't know what the person called anything. So, yeah, they may have called it by coincidence the same thing we called it, but there's a good chance, as a different coder, that they've called their variables completely different things than what we might use. And it's just good news that it doesn't matter. So the concept seems a little strange, and when you start making code in functions, it seems a little strange, but it's really a nice function. And I think the best way to remember it is, again, like, think of these things as families, and they kind of have separate, no relation to each other, except that you can pass this information to this family, and then that family can pass information back if it had a return, like we saw in the last one. And that is everything you need to know, hopefully, for now, about variable scope. Later on, in a different badge, we'll actually start making global variables, and I'll show you how those work, but you don't need to use them for this badge.